Hello, so a very warm welcome everyone to today's webinar on the launch of a new initiative and updates to the Human Trafficking Risk Template. This is the second webinar hosted by the HTRT Development Committee. So my name is Sarah Carpenter and I'm the co-chair of the Development Committee for the HTRT. In my daily work, I'm a senior business and human rights analyst with Ascent Compliance, which is a data management solution provider for the compliance industry. In this role, I help companies tackle risks of slavery and human trafficking throughout their global supply chains. Prior to joining Ascent, I helped improve labor rights in the garment sector of Bangladesh with the UN's International Labour Organization. And I also have experience supporting a number of rights-based international non-governmental organizations. So I am joined today by Michael Littenberg, who's also a member of the HTRT Development Committee. In his daily work, he is a partner with Ropes & Gray, a global law firm with 11 offices worldwide. As part of his practice for almost 30 years, he has been active in advising leading public and private companies on supply chain compliance and corporate social responsibility matters. He advises a significant number of companies on compliance with a range of regulations, many of which have direct application to the topic of today's webinar. So including regulations like the Federal Acquisition Regulation and the UK Modern Slavery Act, to name a few. He also advises clients on disclosure and compliance with legal requirements, the construction and implementation of compliance programs, mitigating customer litigation, NGO, and socially responsible investor risk, and in clients' interactions with these constituencies. Both Michael and I are also joined by Dr. Genevieve LeBaron, who's also a member of the HTRT Development Committee. She's a senior lecturer, associate professor in the Department of Politics at the University of Sheffield and co-chair of the Yale University Modern Slavery Working Group. Her research focuses on the global business of forced labor and governance initiatives to combat it. She is the co-founder and editor of OpenDemocracy.net's Beyond Trafficking and Slavery, which is a popular journalistic site. She has written for leading newspapers, and her research on forced labor has been profiled widely in the media. So today is a very important day in the life of the HTRT. There's two very exciting announcements to make. So firstly, today we launched a new umbrella initiative under which the template will now be housed. And that initiative is called the Social Responsibility Alliance. Secondly, and you may have guessed this actually already from the banners in today's webinar and some of the language included on the previous slide, but we also released version 1.2 of the template, which includes a number of improvements, one of which is a change in the template's name. So as Michael, Genevieve, and I will discuss later in today's webinar, the template is now named the Slavery and Trafficking Risk Template, whereas previously, of course, it was the HTRT. So that helps to explain why you're now seeing STRT up on your slide deck. So before launching into a discussion on these two topics, however, Michael, Genevieve, and I will first discuss recent updates to the slavery and human trafficking landscape. And these updates, of course, are ones that are of relevance to organizations with long supply chains. We'll then turn our attention to the initiative, the one that I've just referenced now. I'll provide a very short, recap and introduction to the STRT for those who aren't familiar with the template, and we'll then turn our attention to an overview of the key improvements made between the previous version and the one that was released today. I always like to leave room and time for questions and answers, and this webinar, of course, is no different. So we'll close with about 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. You certainly don't have to wait until the end to submit your questions. Please feel free to submit them via the box on the right-hand side of your screen throughout the webinar, and we'll happily respond to them at the end of today's discussion. If for whatever reason we aren't able to get to your question during today's webinar, we'll follow up with a question afterwards. Today's webinar will also be recorded, and so you'll all receive a copy of the recording as well as the slide deck in the days to follow. Great. Okay, so now on to the first topic of today's webinar, which is recent updates to the slavery and trafficking landscape. Michael, I'm hoping you can launch off here. So the G20 issued a declaration in early July on sustainable global supply chains. What did this declaration say, and why does it matter to companies and other organizations with supply chains?
Sure, and first, Sarah, thank you for inviting me to be here today. As always, it's a pleasure to be here with you guys and to be here with Genevieve as well. So the declaration that was issued by the G20 was done at their summit, which, as Sarah mentioned, was this past July, and I'll talk a little bit about the commitments that were made at the G20 summit. But to start, I think, just to talk a little bit about just the relevance or potential importance of this to companies, is I think it says a lot about how at least some countries are now thinking about supply chain human rights issues, and also where things may be headed over the medium term from a legislative or otherwise mandatory standpoint. So at the G20 summit, the member companies made several commitments to achieving, in their words, more sustainable and inclusive global supply chains. And I won't go through all of the commitments, but I want to hit on 5 of them in particular. So the first commitment was to fostering the implementation of labor, social, and environmental standards and human rights in line with the UN guiding principles, the ILO tripartite declaration, and also the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. The second commitment was establishing national action plans on business and human rights, and this is, of course, something that's already occurred in many G20 countries, including the United States. The third commitment was underlining the responsibility of business to exercise due diligence, which is something that many of you are grappling with in both mandatory and non-mandatory contexts. Fourth commitment, taking immediate and effective measures to eliminate child labor by 2025, which is probably somewhat ambitious, as well as forced labor, human trafficking, and all forms of modern slavery. And then finally, the fifth commitment that I want to highlight is supporting access to remedy and non-judicial grievance mechanisms, such as the OECD National Contact Point. And this is something that's been a big focus of the NGO community, and this is also one that's been implemented in a number of countries, including the United States. I'll also just mention that at the G20 summit, the G20 labor and employment ministers also adopted a declaration, and in many respects, it was of course aligned with the broader commitments of the G20 countries, but in some respects was more granular. And just to highlight a little bit from the declaration by the labor and employment ministers, they indicated that they're committed to immediate and effective measures, again, their words here, toward eradicating modern slavery and human trafficking in global supply chains. And then they also committed to promoting due diligence and transparency in global supply chains by communicating clearly their expectations of businesses, as well as welcoming initiatives to facilitate industry-wide due diligence and to harmonize audit standards. Now, of course, all of these commitments are general, they're high level, they're going to be addressed differently by different countries, and we certainly won't see all of these commitments reduced to legislation or given binding effect. But as I said when I started out, I think this does give a pretty good sense of where things may be headed over time in at least some G20 countries.
Thank you, Michael. That was a really fascinating and informative overview. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Okay, so now on to Genevieve. Actually, I have a question for you. So we're used to seeing companies being put under the spotlight for how well they're tackling modern slavery in their own supply chains, but not necessarily higher educational institutions. I'm wondering if you can please speak to the new pressure we're seeing for universities to take action on these issues.
Sure, and like Michael, I just want to say thank you so much for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be with you, Sarah, and all of you listening in. So yeah, as you're saying, there's been, from the beginning of the legislation that's been increasing responsibilities and reporting for modern slavery, there's been a lot of attention on companies, and especially on large retail and manufacturing organizations. But it's been quite interesting in the past year or so. There's been increasing awareness that there's actually a wide variety of types of organizations that are caught and have increased responsibilities under legislation, including the UK Modern Slavery Act, and that does include higher education organizations. So there's been a recent study from the University of Greenwich which looked at the first round of Modern Slavery Act statements in the UK, published by several dozen universities, as well as university purchasing consortiums. And the study indicated that, like many other types of organizations, higher education organizations are also at a very early stage of learning and reporting with respect to forced labor and human trafficking in their supply chains. Many universities have strong policies in place. They had really strong commitments and zero tolerance policies around abuse of human rights. But in the statements that they released under the Modern Slavery Act, there wasn't very detailed information about products or supply chains that they sourced through, and there was very vague discussion of due diligence procedures and the acknowledgement that there's still quite a long way to go on both of those counts. So I think it's interesting to recognize that universities too are facing challenges under figuring out where their goods come from and what they can do to ensure standards across the supply chain, and that there's scope to build on and deepen university knowledge and reporting on forced labor, and to think about how they're addressing these matters in purchasing and other practices.
Thank you. Thanks for that. That was a really great synopsis of the developments in relation to higher educational institutions. And you've struck, I think you've hit a really important point there, in that, as you say, the new regulations like UK Modern Slavery Act, for instance, it doesn't just target private sector companies, as you say. It's any organization with a supply chain. So of course that would then include higher educational institutions, but even more broad than that, NGOs. For instance, I'm aware of a number of large NGOs who are, compelled to disclose under the UK Modern Slavery Act. So it just reinforces the wide application of this act and other acts, that may be forthcoming. So that's actually a good segue then to my next question, and keen to pass the mic back to Michael here. So the forthcoming Modern Slavery Act out of Australia, it's making headlines worldwide. I wonder if you could please speak to what's happening and what we can expect to see over the next few months.
Sure. So this one is an even more recent development than the G20 declaration, although it's something that's been anticipated for some time. So last month, around mid-month or so, the Australian government put out a consultation paper, and in the consultation paper, they proposed the adoption of modern slavery legislation. And for those of you on the phone that are familiar with the UK and California modern slavery legislation, this one will also look familiar. It's based very heavily on the UK approach. In the interest of time, I won't go through everything that's in the consultation paper, but I do want to hit on some of the highlights of what's being proposed. So the Australian government is proposing a reporting threshold of not less than 100 million Australian dollars in total annual revenue, and that's approximately 80 million US as of today. As contemplated, the reporting requirement will apply not only to entities headquartered in Australia, but also to entities that have any part of their operations in Australia. So this will pick up a significant number of multinationals, and probably many of you on the phone today, just like many of you are picked up under the UK Modern Slavery Act. The entities that are subject to the reporting requirement would be required to report on their actions to address modern slavery, and not only their supply chains, but also their own operations. So similar approach to the UK Modern Slavery Act approach. And the Australian government is proposing also that the subject entities be required to report on substantially the same topics that are contained in the Modern Slavery Act. However, Under the Modern Slavery Act, reporting on the enumerated topics is optional, so they're guidance topics or potential topics, but they're not required reporting topics. The Australian government is proposing that the reporting criteria be mandatory. However, they would be high-level principles-based criteria, so companies would have the flexibility to determine the specific information to be provided under each of the criteria. And of course, companies would also be able to include information that's not required by the regulation in their statements, as well as many companies are currently doing under both the UK Modern Slavery Act and the California Act. Like in the UK, statements would be required to be approved at both the board level, and also signed by a director, and companies would also be required to publish their statements on their website. One of the things that the Australian government also is contemplating is a publicly accessible and searchable central repository for statements, on whether that's a government or a third-party repository. It's important to note that at this point, the government has only introduced a consultation paper, so we don't have draft legislation yet. That's expected to be introduced sometime during the first half of 2018. Between now and the end of the year, there's going to be a number of public consultation meetings in Australia. People can also submit comments online to the proposal made in the consultation paper. That comment period is open for another month or so. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the legislation may change from what's described in the consultation paper. Also, the timing of both the adoption of legislation as well as when statements the first statements will be due. That's something that's still to be determined. Last thing I'll just mention on this, Sarah pointed out, this is one that's been receiving a lot of press and a lot of attention. We actually just yesterday put out an alert on the Australian Modern Slavery Act, comparing it to the UK MSA in California, and that's something that is available on our website for anybody that wants it. If you just go to ropesgray.com and go to the publications page on that, you should be able to find it pretty easily.
Super, thank you, Michael. And I'll see about circulating that paper actually at the same time as when we circulate the slides from today's webinar as well, so that attendees can have easy access there. Thank you for that. So you ended with a very clear, I think, call to action actually for people who are tuned in. You do have an opportunity, as Michael said, to submit comments on their drafts. So take advantage. Fantastic. Okay, so now actually back to Genevieve. One last question here for you before we move on to the next topic of discussion. So you recently published research calling attention to two key slavery and human trafficking risks. The first one being risks within domestic supply chains, and the second one being risks related to subcontracting in labor supply chains. I'm wondering if you can please share with our audience the findings of your research and its implications for organizations with supply chains.
Sure, I'd be really happy to share that with you. So this is research that I've conducted jointly with a couple of colleagues, Professor Andrew Crane at the Bath University Management School, Professor Jean Alain at Monash University Faculty of Law, and Ms. Laia Beb Bahani at Simon Fraser University in Canada. So we're a team comprised of a political scientist, a lawyer, a criminologist, and a business scholar. And our research is publishing one of the first studies that's looking at forced labor in supply chains within the UK. We focused on the construction and food industries. And the main finding is that companies, even with the best of intentions, are failing to prevent and recognize the risks of worker abuse domestically and in their labor supply chain, as you said, Sarah. And so I'll just briefly talk about each of these two risks domestically and the labor supply chain risks, in case it's helpful for those who are listening. In the first case, what we found is that for large organizations covered under the UK Modern Slavery Act and similar legislation, there's been a lot of attention lately to the risk of forced labor and trafficking in supply chains that are located overseas. This makes a lot of sense, and it's important given that, statistically speaking, the risk of severe labor exploitation, modern slavery, human trafficking are much higher in countries like India, China, Bangladesh than they are in countries like the UK, Canada, or the United States. But what we found is that research is that there are also risks of forced labor within domestic supply chains, and that includes in developing countries. And many companies are sourcing from domestic supply chains in which forced labor is known to be a risk. So these include the food, garment, construction, and household goods industries, as well as those linked to services such as car washes and cleaning, and many others which we write about in the paper. So to give you an example of what this looks like, department store John Lewis in the UK highlighted this risk in its 2016-2017 Human Rights and Modern Slavery report, following the conviction of one of its UK bed suppliers, Cozy Sleep, for exploiting what was called by the judge a slave workforce within the UK. And so what we're looking at is the risk of forced labor in these domestic supply chains, and we're trying to explain how forced labor manifests within these supply chains domestically and give some guidance about what companies can do to try to mitigate and be aware of those risks. The second risk our research identified is the risk of forced labor within the labor supply chain. So that's what we've tried to illustrate here on the slide. You'll see all of those boxes that go from P1 to P4 and then down into the dark L's. I'll explain those in just a minute, but essentially what we found is that most incidences of forced labor that are happening domestically are several steps removed from a supplier's core workforce. So it's a hidden problem because companies that rely on layers of outsourcing, subcontracting, and informal hiring of temporary staff are actually in the dark about the background of these staff. So returning to give you an example to the John Lewis case that I mentioned, they'd been conducting audits of that supplier and the supplier was passing the audits, and the use of forced labor was undetected because it came from informal recruitment along the labor supply chain, which doesn't tend to be looked at as well within processes that are currently set up to detect risk. So it's standard practice now for many responsible companies to understand supply chains of their products. So in this diagram, the P1 to the P4, but we need to start taking the same approach for staff so that we're understanding the risks of forced labor and trafficking within these labor supply chains. So to talk briefly about this diagram, this is a diagram of illustrating the patterns of forced labor in the food industry in the UK. And what we're trying to show here is that, maybe the audit or the different due diligence procedures are focusing on the P1 to the P4, so the supplier, the farmer, processor, retailer, essentially they're following the product, but that they may not be fully encompassing the labor supply chain. And that's problematic because the way that forced labor is getting into these chains has to do with informal labor subcontracting. And often, it's not just the sort of first level of it, it's several layers of labor subcontracting, often at a time of, say peak harvest season or when there's a temporary need for more workers and there's not sufficient attention to who these workers are and how they're being provided. So the key risk and challenge is that different agents will rarely, if ever, be formally documented as official suppliers, and so the audit trail typically overlooks them. And it's these labor chains that make forced labor practices seemingly invisible, even when the workers subjected to them are right in front of us, in the farms, factories, and construction sites that surround communities within countries like the UK. So to sum up, we are underscoring in our research the fact that while UK-based companies are ramping up efforts to combat slavery in overseas supply chains, there's a need to understand the risk of forced labor in supply chains that are domestic, especially around labor supply chains, and that is a similar phenomenon as the domestic industries located in the US, Canada, and across Europe. And finally, we need to really be looking at our processes for tracing and monitoring labor supply chains and making sure that those are fit for purpose in terms of being able to get down into these labor subcontracting relations through which forced labor tends to manifest.
Super. Thank you so much for that. And I think you know what you've just reviewed there has really good application for those who have tuned in today's webinar with their own supply chains. To keep mind of these risks, as you say. So thank you so much for sharing that. Super. Okay, so now on to the next topic of today's discussion, which is the overview of the new umbrella initiative, the one that I had referenced at the start of today's webinar, and it's the one, of course, that the STRT will now be housed under. So very quickly, the name of this new initiative is the Social Responsibility Alliance, and there's a couple of things that I wanted to call out in reference to the name there. So you'll note the broad nature of the name, and this was done on purpose to allow the Alliance to grow and to expand its work without limitation alongside an evolving regulatory environment, as well as in consideration with changing stakeholder expectations. Another term that I wanted to call out here is the word responsibility. We chose that word because we felt that it served as an implicit call to action in and of itself in compelling organizations to promote labor rights as well as human rights throughout their supply chains. And then lastly, there the word alliance, which we chose in its clear projection of a joint effort by coordinated parties to provoke meaningful change on these issues. So moving on from there, we have our mission statement, which is to provide companies throughout the supply chain with the data tools needed to build socially responsible supply chains in response to regulatory requirements and stakeholder expectations. By facilitating the collection of human and labor rights data, we catalyze continuous improvement in global supply chains and the lives of those working within them. So this statement, of course, it focuses on our primary purpose, which is the provision of tools to companies of all tiers of the supply chain to help them make responsible sourcing decisions that are founded on data. And this actually brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you, Michael. I wonder if you could, tell our audience why we chose to focus on data tools here.
Sure. And first, I just want to, give, a plug to Sarah as well as her other co-chair for really helping to direct the focus of the Alliance. Without Sarah doing this, we certainly wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today. So why the focus on data tools? Well, I think that this is an area where the SRA can do a lot to really help companies to efficiently and effectively implement their compliance programs, and not only looking at it from a strict compliance program perspective, but also help companies mitigate risk, which obviously then also has benefits for other stakeholders as well. As we've seen with conflict minerals, at most companies, data tools are critical to gathering information. They enable companies to gather data in an organized, consistent fashion. When a tool is widely used, it certainly also makes it easier for suppliers to provide data, and then data tools also have the added benefit of allowing data to be searched so that companies can more easily sift through the data to generate KPIs for internal use, for external use, as well as also allowing companies to identify risks so that they can then implement appropriate risk mitigation measures.
Super, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think you touched on some really, really great points there, and thanks for that. Thank you, by the way, that was really kind. But I'll note, even just to take a step back here and look at the STRT itself and what drove its creation, it was, an understanding of that there was this massive gap in the market when it came to standardized data collection tools. And now working in the CSR space for a number of years, I, at Ascent Compliance, have good visibility into different tools that are used by a wide range of companies. And it often strikes me actually how similar many of the question sets that companies are using are to one another. But of course, there are slight differences there, which, then necessitates that suppliers, respond uniquely to each and every one of those. So we have seen, that suppliers and compliance professionals professionals within organizations are, increasingly feeling, burdened, if you will, by all these, unique data requests from all of their separate clients, which, as I mentioned, often have, good synergies among themselves. So this really was, kind of our call to action here. There is this huge need here. We're very well placed to fill this need, and this is, our huge, driving factor in wanting to focus on these data tools. It might not be the, sexiest thing for us to focus on, but it really is, as Michael said, an important part when it comes to tackling these issues in global supply chains. So it's one that we wanted to take on as an alliance. So a couple other things that I wanted to call out actually in this mission statement before I move on to the vision. And they're as follows. So the one, of course, the first one is that this mission statement, it was drafted, with the understanding that organizations, they're driven, in taking action for a diverse range of reasons. Many companies are driven by changes in the regulatory environment. Others are keen to, keep stride with their peers. Others perhaps are more sensitive to consumer expectations, investor expectations. So this mission statement was very much drafted with those different drivers in mind. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that this mission statement, it does call attention to, the subject matter at hand here, which is, at the heart of, why we do what we do, which is, supply chain workers and their well-being. So of course, while our primary focus, will be to equip companies with data collection tools, we really did want to call attention to those, who these tools are ultimately designed to impact. So now to move on to the vision statement. So the vision statement of the Social Responsibility Alliance, is that it seeks to provide trusted open source tools that facilitate the collection of complete responsible sourcing data from supply chains. So this vision statement, of course, it's a logical flow down from the mission statement, but it does call attention to, an important differentiating factor, which is open source, the fact that these tools will be open source. So this is a question for you, Genevieve. I'm wondering if you could speak to, why is it so important that these tools be open source?
Sure. I think that's a great question, and please, you and Michael, feel free to also jump in here because you've been involved longer than I have. But my first thought is that it's really important for these tools to be open source so that there's transparency and accessibility. So that any organization who wishes to can have access to the tools and use them towards gathering data and improving socially responsible supply chains.
Super, thanks for that. I think you've said it very well. As you know, the primary benefit of adopting a standardized template really comes through widespread adoption. Having these tools then be open source and available to a range of companies. So whether these are companies, for instance, who file their own data in filing cabinets, to ones who have systems on their own computers, to ones who use data management partners. So a wide swath of companies here, but at the end of the day, widespread adoption certainly is central to reducing the burden on supply chains, on suppliers rather, and having these tools be open source is an important strategy there in achieving that end. Michael, could you speak, I wonder if you could share with the audience, some, in terms, if you could speak to what's on the horizon for the Social Responsibility Alliance. What can they expect? What do we have ahead of us in the months to come?
Sure. Well, I think whatever we have ahead of us is whatever you tell us we have to do. But seriously though, so I think in the near term, the members of the committee, as well as other stakeholders, are going to be getting together to develop a plan to expand the alliance work beyond just the STRT, or previously the HTRT, which was the initial focus. I think some of those details certainly remain to be worked out. But what we do know, I think, at this point, is that the Alliance's work is going to focus on data collection tools with a human and labor rights focus. What we still have to, I think, spend some time thinking more about and talking to stakeholders about is the specific coverage of future tools. In other words, whether the committee will ultimately decide to take a narrow focus with respect to human rights and labor rights issues. So, for example, limiting its work for the time being to potentially expand to data collection tools relating to child labor, or will it instead decide to take a more comprehensive approach, for example, by focusing on all the core conventions of the ILO? Personally, I suspect that the committee will probably land someplace in the middle so that it doesn't get so bogged down that nothing gets done. And then also, I think, there's a sensitivity that we certainly don't want to be duplicating what others out there are already perhaps doing well. So adding value where we can do it. In the timeline, in terms of the timeline for the release of future tools, I think that's going to, of course, depend upon how the SRA defines its mandate. So that's something that will also remain to be determined.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. And you touched on an important point actually there, which is, of course, that this planning exercise, it will involve current members of the STRT Development Committee, but also other interested stakeholders, because really the greater the diversity of opinions around the table, the stronger the outcome will be, in my mind. So Genevieve, I wonder if you could touch on that briefly. In your mind, why should other organizations get involved in the Alliance's work?
Sure. Gosh, I think there are so many reasons. The first one, to go back to something Michael said at the beginning, is this is an issue that is not going to go away. It's becoming more and more important in global governance circles. The Sustainable Development Goals include goal 8.7, which is the eradication of forced labor and child labor by 2025 and forced labor by 2030. And the alliance that's formed around that has a specific focus and action group looking at supply chains. So the issue of forced labor, human trafficking, child labor in supply chains is only going to increase in importance. And I think that pressures from government, from different NGOs and international organizations are only going to improve increase for businesses to be taking this seriously and to be demonstrating that they're engaged in efforts to deal with this problem. And potentially there could even be a move towards demonstrating, not just the efforts, but the effectiveness of those efforts to deal with the problem of forced labor and trafficking within supply chains. So this is an issue that is going to increase in importance, and I think that the Social Responsibility Alliance has a really important role to play within efforts that are unfolding to tackle the issue of forced labor and trafficking. Data gathering is going to be a really, really important part of addressing forced labor and supply chains, both in terms of trying to understand risks and how to mitigate those risks, but also in terms of benchmarking to be able to look year on year at improvements and being able to look at what's working in terms of eradicating forced labor, child labor, and human trafficking from supply chains. So I think that it is something that that organizations should become involved in. Organizations have a number of different drivers and reasons, as you mentioned, Sarah, for becoming involved. But I think that the timing of the Social Responsibility Alliance and its efforts to expand its works, as you mentioned, are really, really well timed in terms of addressing a growing concern within global governance and many different states about these issues.
Super. Thanks for that. Another thing I wanted to note, just to add to what you've just said there, is to again raise the fact that we really are at an important and interesting juncture in our history as an alliance, and that in getting involved, organizations, they have good scope to influence the alliance's direction, to influences the alliance's work. You know, I've certainly seen that in even, you know, putting forth, you know, developing the mission statement, vision, you know, the name of the alliance as well. Although it, you know, it was a process that was driven by myself and my fellow co-chair on the HTRT, or sorry, now STRT Development Committee, it was, you know, well informed by feedback that we received from other committee members. So we do operate on that model. It's a consensus-based model as an alliance. So you know, just wanting to reinforce the good opportunity that organizations have to get involved and to help shape the alliance's work. And of course, it's you know, beyond that, an excellent opportunity to connect with others within your field who are tackling these issues. I know that a number of members on our development committee, they gain, you know, benefit in speaking with other companies who are, you know, facing similar challenges as they are, so that they can share, you know, best practices and lessons learned. So there really is good opportunity for collaboration. Great. So I hope this has given everyone a good, you know, idea of the Social Responsibility Alliance. We've ended, you know, with a pretty strong call to action there. I encourage you to get in touch if you're interested in getting involved. In either case, we'll certainly, you know, keep you all updated as our work evolves and progresses. Okay, so now on to the next topic of today's webinar, which has to do with the next version of, you know, the newly released version 1.2 of the STRT. But really quickly, before talking about changes to the template, I wanted to very quickly, you know, talk about the template itself to ensure that everyone has the background information that they need to understand, you know, the forthcoming remarks on revisions to the template. So what is the STRT? It is a free open source industry standard template used to assist companies, you know, in compliance with slavery and human trafficking regulations. So it seeks to be the standard template for the sharing and collection of slavery and human trafficking risk and compliance related data across supply chains. For those of you on the line who are familiar with the conflict minerals reporting template, the STRT very much took inspiration from that template there. It collects data on a whole host of different topics. I like to think of them in three big buckets. The first part of the template, it collects data on a supplier's exposure to risk, slavery and human trafficking risk as a result of, you know, the characteristics of their workforce, for instance, the location in which they're operated, their industry as well. The second section of the template, it then collects data on how well the supplier is then controlling for that risk. So it enables companies to compare those two against each other. You know, for suppliers who are exposed to a high level of risk, companies will then be looking for strong management practices in place to control for that risk. Beyond that, it includes questions specific to regulatory compliance. So for instance, you know, at first glance, people will notice that there are a number of questions within the STRT that relate specifically to the US federal acquisition regulation. It's a short template, it's 20 questions, and that's on purpose. As a committee, we're very mindful of wanting to keep the template as short as possible, though of course, ensuring that it does collect the necessary data because, you know, in not wanting to overly burden suppliers. It also includes requests for supporting documentation so that companies then have scope to verify responses, you know, within the template itself. Microsoft Excel format, so easily digestible by companies worldwide, freely downloadable on our new website here, so sraglobal.org. We're approaching our 1-year anniversary actually as a template. It was first launched in October 2016, how the time flies. It's maintained by the development committee, of which, you know, Michael, Genevieve, and myself are all members. I myself am one of the co-chairs, and that demonstrates our, you know, our commitment to continuously evolve and update the template to ensure that it keeps strides with, you know, changing risks. So Genevieve, you know, had called attention to a number of important risk factors that she's discovered through her, you know, recent research initiatives. You know, this just reinforces for me the value and, you know, how crucial and important it is that we continuously update and evolve the template so that it keeps pace with those that new learning. But of course, we are sensitive in not wanting to release templates too often, because that can of course unduly burden companies. So we are aiming to have the next version released in about a year's time, in coordination with the next updated Trafficking in Persons report by the U.S. Department of State. So in terms of how does the template itself assist companies in their compliance programs, the first one and the most obvious, of course, is that it helps companies identify risk and regulatory compliance at the level of the individual supplier, which is important when companies have vast supply chains. It gives companies important insights into risk mitigation, so it gives them actionable data, so that they can then inform their follow-up risk mitigation action, like supplier training, for instance. And involving suppliers in the risk identification process, it fosters constructive dialogue throughout the supply chain, and it also raises suppliers' awareness of a company's core values and commitments on human rights. And allows companies to strengthen their public disclosure statements, and it also allows them actually, in using the template, let's say on an annual basis, for instance, or at regular intervals, whichever companies feel is best suited to their compliance program, it allows them to monitor and actually track year-on-year changes. We've already called attention to a number of, the benefits in adopting the STRT. The first, of course, being that it reduces the burden on supply chains. Not only is it easy to use, but it's one that, a variety of companies are using, so suppliers can complete it once and send it out to a whole host of their clients. This garners higher response rates and better data quality, actually, as suppliers gain familiarity with the template itself. It's robust, credible, and proven. It's trusted by companies worldwide. And again, it is an Excel template, so it's not exclusive to any platform. Okay, so that was a mouthful from me. So now to move on to our final portion of the webinar here before we launch into our Q&A. So I wanted to run through some key improvements that you'll see in this latest version of the STRT. The first one, of course, being its new name, Slavery and Trafficking Risk Template, which was chosen so that it reflects the different terminology that's used worldwide. Genevieve, so different stakeholders, they use different terms. I think this space in general, it's perhaps infamous actually for all the different terms that are often used, like slavery, human trafficking, modern slavery, forced labor. Could you speak to that briefly? I wonder if you could speak to us in terms of what is the difference really between these different terms, all the different ones that people have undoubtedly heard in their reading and in their discussions with other stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, these terms are used so interchangeably and so inconsistently that, we could have a whole webinar just on one of the terms, never mind, looking at slavery, trafficking, and forced labor. So to be brief, because I know we want to move to questions, I think, slavery is a catch-all term. It's the most imprecise of the terms that are used to talk about these forms of exploitation. It's used really in consistency within the media. The advantage of that term is that it's very broad. It's not clearly defined though within international law or within many different jurisdictions. But there have been efforts among lawyers and legal experts to define modern slavery in international law, which you're welcome to look at. They're called the Bellagio-Harvard Guidelines on the Legal Parameters of Slavery. They're more, too extensive to summarize here. So I think the best thing to think about is slavery is, the least well-defined, biggest catch-all term. Under that sort of umbrella of modern slavery is, our two terms, forced labor and human trafficking. And those are a lot easier to define. Forced labor is defined very straightforwardly in the International Labor Organization's 1934 Forced Labor Convention, which defines forced labor as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. So in other words, forced labor is work that people do that's involuntary, that's done under coercion or it's threat. And the most common forms of coercion are physical coercion, psychological, or financial. The ILO have provided a lot of guidance about how to define forced labor and how to identify it in practice. So that's all easily, accessible online. Human trafficking then is the key difference there is that it involves movement. So that concept's also defined in international law by the UN protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. And it has 3 key definitions, but essentially the big difference here is that it has to involve recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. So people need to move in order for trafficking to occur. They need to be moved through the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion. And the purpose of their movement in order to fall under this definition has to be for the purpose of sexual or forced labor exploitation or the removal of organs. So human trafficking is an act that is the movement of people through the use of coercion, and the purpose is of forced labor. So if you will, forced labor is part of the definition of human trafficking. But the key difference there is that trafficking always involves movement of people. Forced labor doesn't need to involve that in the same way.
Super. Thank you for that. Great. That adds a lot of clarity, so thank you. Okay, so now on to our second key improvement here, which is languages. So the STRT is now available actually in multiple languages, 7 to be precise. It's been translated to German, French, Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish, and we may add languages over time. For now, these are the ones that we're starting with as they're the most commonly used languages across global supply chains. So my next question is for Michael. Michael, why is language so important when it comes to supply chain data collection?
Sure. Well, at least for those of us who are in New York, I'm sure it's different in Sheffield and in Ontario, in Ottawa, is we like to think that if we just speak louder, that people who don't speak English can understand us. Of course, we all know that that's not the case, and in any event, that doesn't work particularly well with a questionnaire that's in writing. So, in order to enable to help ensure that suppliers complete requests, I think it's very important that you have reporting templates, instructions, training materials that are available in key local languages. This is certainly something that we've seen make a big difference in many supply chain traceability exercises. The most well-known being conflict minerals. Sarah mentioned the CMRT before. That's currently available in 10 languages. I think having the 7 key languages here is hugely important. I think it's a great start. Sarah alluded to, I think, we might at some point expand to some additional languages, but certainly even getting to 7 is a tremendous amount of work, and it's something I think that will take some time to probably do.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, that was really valuable. And I'll actually throw a statistic to our audience. This is one that I pulled from our own data here at Ascent Compliance, but we've actually found that response rates for non-English suppliers are on average 27% higher with language campaigns, which reinforces the importance of communicating with suppliers in their local language. The next key improvement is specific to question 16, which we've now split into 2 questions to improve clarity. The coverage is more or less the same, but it's much more clear from a data quality perspective on what's being asked within this question. If you have any more specific questions to that, please do reach out. But in the interest of time, I'll move on to the last and 4th key improvement to the STRT, which is that we've of course updated the country tab so that it reflects the Department of State's latest Trafficking in Persons report. What this has meant is we've removed countries that have advanced to Tier 1. So those are countries whose governments adequately address these types of risks within their jurisdictions. And we've added 2 countries who have actually moved from Tier 1 to a lower tier country. So another question for you, Michael, why is it so important for organizations to regularly update their country risk analysis?
Sure. So it's important to keep in mind that human trafficking isn't a static issue. It's affected by many things, but in particular economic and political events in particular regions, and those can of course sometimes change quickly. So for example, if you look at conditions in Syria, those have resulted in human trafficking in the Turkish garment industry. And 5 years ago, this was something that wasn't perceived as much of an issue, if any issue, by most people. Also, issues that aren't necessarily new do come to light from time to time. So it might be Chinese goods that are used producing forced labor that are stopped at the border by U.S. Customs now that the consumptive demand exception has been repealed under the Tariff Act, or it could be issues that are brought to light by NGOs, such as those involving portions of the Thai seafood supply chain. So, and then also I think in the years to come, we're going to see more and more new instances of modern slavery that are identified. I think that this is going to be the case due to a confluence of several fairly recent factors. These include things like the greater awareness of modern slavery as an issue, and we've certainly all seen a lot more on this in the last year or 2 years than we did previously. The increase in modern slavery legislation and disclosure, we've talked a little bit about that earlier, and there's certainly more of that on the way. It's also become easier to document and raise issues in a world that's connected by smartphones. And then also now there's a zero tolerance policy at many large companies around these sorts of issues. So I think all of this advocates for an ongoing and flexible compliance effort around this issue.
Super, thank you, Michael. Okay, so this now brings us to our Q&A, and I have to say, Michael, when you and I were, discussing this webinar in advance of today, you had actually warned me that you felt that we might run over time because we were quite ambitious in what we wanted to cover, and I'm totally, willing to say that you were right here. I had hoped to leave a bit more time, so apologies everyone, but we still do have 5 minutes for Q&As. So if you haven't already, submitted your questions, please do so. So I have a couple up on the screen here. The first one I'm happy to respond to, and then the second one perhaps I can ask Michael or Genevieve to respond to. So the first one asked, will we be going as far as reaching out to work with other software providers with regards to the Social Responsibility Alliance's work? What I wanted to say in reference to this is, for those software providers who are interested in getting involved, please be proactive in reaching out to us. We'd love to work with you. We will be proactively reaching out to a number of key stakeholders, but the stakeholder, as you know, the stakeholder landscape is huge when it comes to these issues. So, if you're keen to involved, I really encourage you to be proactive in coming to contact us. Another question that's come in, and this is the one that I wanted to pass over to Genevieve actually, and Michael as well. It has to do with human trafficking. So Genevieve, in your definition of it, you mentioned the need for transportation. The question is, this audience member was under the impression that transportation was not actually required in order for a crime to be considered human trafficking. I wonder if you wanted to shed some light on that, and again whether transportation is indeed required. Perhaps it's definition based, but I wanted to pass that question over to you.
Sure. I think the first thing to say about that is that it's going to depend very much on the jurisdiction that you're operating within. So certainly, definitely look at that carefully. And I mean, I'm a political scientist, not a lawyer, so it would be good to clarify that, with legal folk as well. But in terms of the actual international legal definition from the UN protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, also known as the Trafficking in Persons Protocol, as I said, the beginning of the definition is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, etc. And so, the difference there is that recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons has to be present, and that has to be accomplished through force or the threat of force for the purpose of forced labor or sexual exploitation or removal of organs. So again, I think it would be how that definition is interpreted in different jurisdictions is something that would be interesting to look closely at. but certainly it does need to involve recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons to qualify as human trafficking within international law.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, so we're almost up at our time here. Before we log off, I just wanted to draw attention to a few, other resources that our audience has available to them if they're keen to learn more about the STRT. So this, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is our second webinar. Our first one was hosted by my colleague, Kate Dunbar, as well as a number of, other members of the STRT Development Committee, and it was launched in May, and it's available for, download on the website. So, I'd encourage you to give it a listen. It speaks more concretely about how companies can use STRT as part of their anti-human trafficking and slavery program. You can expect more webinars. We hope to release a new webinar, every few months. And again, on the website, you'll see a number of other, interesting resources, one of which is our frequently asked questions guide and a supplier guide, which, helps suppliers complete the STRT themselves. So that's it from us. We're coming up to our time here. A big thank you to you all for tuning in. If we weren't able to get to your questions today, as I mentioned, we'll respond in writing following today's webinar. If any other questions come to mind, later today or at a future date, please do reach out, and please, take our call to action to heart. If you're keen to get involved in the Alliance's work, please get in touch. So a big thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Genevieve. It really is. It was a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And I hope to chat with you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.